Thanks, Anna. Morning, church. It's a joy to be here with you today. Lack of heat and lack of oxygen are two of the big dangers that face you when you're climbing Mount Everest. A danger that people maybe don't think as much about is lack of light. But for a group of climbers in 1996, lack of light almost cost them their lives. John Krakauer is the name of an author who wrote a book called Into Thin Air, where he tells the story of how he climbed Mount Everest in 1996. And he talks about how he climbed, he reached the summit. There's nothing there. So you just hang out for a few minutes and then you head back down. So he starts heading down, and a storm picks up. Now, of course, when you're on Everest, you are among the clouds. A storm is not what you want at this point. So there's this storm, there's thunder, lightning, there's wind, and the storm was really causing him to sort of lose his way, or be a bit disoriented. But over time, he wasn't actually that far from base camp, so over time he was able to find his way back to base camp number 4, he waited out the storm in a shelter at the base camp. There's another group of climbers that day, 4 of them, and they didn't make it back to base camp that day. They reached the summit, they started heading down, and the storm picked up, and it kind of enveloped them. They became disoriented, they lost their way, didn't know where they were, and then they kind of wandered, and nighttime came. So now it's stormy and it's dark, okay? And I have to imagine they had some lights, but they were insufficient, so it wasn't enough to make them able to see and navigate, and so they're effectively kind of blind up on Everest. And so they made the difficult decision, and they said, we're going to wait out the night here, just out exposed to the elements. And so they just laid down where they were. They said, you know what, we're not getting anywhere. They lay down where they were, not knowing where they were, not knowing what the night would bring. I'm sure they had the single worst sleep of their lives. But eventually morning came, the storm passed, and morning came, and with it came daylight. And daylight revealed something surprising. On the south wall of Everest, there's a cliff that's a 4,000-foot sheer drop. And without knowing it, they had laid down one step from that edge. And they spent the entire night lying right next to this edge, this 4,000-foot drop, and they had no idea the entire night. They lived to tell the tale, but it was a close call. See, for this group of climbers, walking in darkness almost led them to death. And that's what we're going to talk about today. That's what we're going to see Jesus talk about today. And so we're continuing our sermon series in the Gospel of John, which is called God Among Us. And Jesus is going to talk today about walking in light and walking in darkness. We've kind of heard hints of that as we've been singing and through our scripture reading today as well. Just a reminder that this is a great time to jump into a care group. We publish study guides so that care groups can follow along with these series. And so if you can set aside one evening every 2 weeks, that's a great way to get more out of the series and to go deeper in community. And so I encourage you to sign up at the Welcome Center for that. They're kicking off over this last half of September, so you can jump in without missing a beat. I'll incentivize you a little bit. Maybe this isn't an incentive, but we're deliberately skipping over a story, actually, in the first part of chapter 8. We're skipping over one of the most beloved stories from the life of Jesus, and we're skipping it on purpose. And if you want to find out why, join a care group. So, it's going to be in the study guide. There you go. I know that's going to change your plans drastically. So, here we have this text. We already heard it read. It was shorter this week. And really, we're just going to focus on this one verse, this one claim that Jesus makes. Okay, verse 12. where he stands up and says, I'm the light of the world. If you follow me, you won't have to walk in darkness, because you will have the light that leads to life. If you were here last week, you may remember that we're talking about, in the story, we're talking about Jesus attending a festival called the Festival of Shelters. That's going to be John chapter 7 through to the first half of 10. Is Jesus attending and interacting with people at this festival called the Festival of Shelters. And just to review a little bit, the Festival of Shelters was created for the Jews to remember a part of their national story. 1,500 years before Jesus, their ancestors, the Israelites, were freed from slavery. You can read this story in the book of Exodus in your Bible. They were freed from slavery in Egypt. And God led them into the desert. And for 40 years, they lived as nomads in the desert. They lived moving around in the desert. And they lived in tents or shelters. That's why it's called that, Festival of Shelters. And so for 8 days every year, Jews would come to Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem, they would camp out. Okay, they would actually stay, not in houses, but they would stay in tents as a way of remembering their ancestors. So that's where we are right now. And we said last week that there are 3 themes to the Festival of Shelters. Okay, every holiday kind of has themes, and there are 3 for this one. So the one we talked about last week was, okay, that's one of them. Presence of God is one of them. Water. Water we talked about last week. Presence of God is going to come up next week. And then there's a 3rd theme, which we're going to talk about today. And it's light, not surprisingly. The theme that they're going to talk about today is light. Now, why is light an important theme in the Festival of Shelters? Well, it goes back to that original Exodus story. So if you read the story, God's people are led out of slavery. Immediately they're led into the desert, and the people have some important questions for Moses. Moses, what are we going to eat? And God provides them with food. Moses, what are we going to drink? And God through Moses provides them with water. And then there's another really important question. God, Moses, how are we going to know where to go? How are we going to find our way in this desert? The Sinai Desert is 60,000 square kilometers. Even today, you can very easily get lost there and get yourself into trouble. It was so daunting and punishing to try and travel this desert that it was considered Egypt's first line of defense. And so the Sinai Desert is the only land bridge into Africa. And so if you wanted to attack Egypt with your army, you first had to cross this desert, and then you get to the other side, you're dehydrated, right? You're sunburnt, and now you have to wage war on Egypt. It's part of why Egypt flourished so much in the ancient world, because they had this natural defense. And in the 6th century BCE, the Persian Empire actually did it. They crossed the desert and they conquered Egypt. And it was considered a great accomplishment because they managed with their army to travel the Sinai Desert. So here's Israel. And they've been in slavery for 400 years. These are not educated people. These are not people who are familiar with traveling or navigation. How are they going to find their way in this desert? It's just sand dune after sand dune. How are they going to avoid getting lost and getting into trouble? God provides direction. Just like God provided bread and water, He provides direction. And so in Exodus 13, it says, the Israelites left Succoth and camped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. The Lord went ahead of them. He guided them during the day with a pillar of cloud and, listen, provided light at night with a pillar of fire. This allowed them to travel by day or by night. And the Lord did not remove the pillar of cloud or pillar of fire from its place in front of the people. So that's early in the story. And then right at the end of Exodus, the author says a little bit more in Exodus 40. It says, now whenever the cloud, the pillar, lifted from the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out on their journey following it. But if the cloud did not rise, they remained where they were until it lifted. The cloud of the Lord hovered over the tabernacle during the day, and at night fire glowed inside the cloud, so the whole family of Israel could see it. This continued throughout all their journeys. And so the story is that God guided them through the desert for 40 years with, in the daytime, a pillar of cloud, and then at nighttime, a pillar of fire, or Exodus 40 says it more like it's the same pillar of cloud, but there's fire within it, like there's light within it. And for 40 years they followed the pillar through the desert. When the pillar moved, they moved. When the pillar stopped, they stopped and camped there. So, fast forward now, 1,500 years. Fast forward 1,500 years, here we are, we're at the time of Jesus, we're at the Festival of Shelters, and one of the big themes of the Festival of Shelters is light. And the reason why one of the themes is light is going back to that reality, going back to that part of the story where God guided Israel through the desert. Now, obviously, there's a very literal link between light and light imagery and the light from the pillar of fire, right? And then more generally speaking, there's just this light imagery, and light is kind of symbolic for God generally showing Israel the way, right? He lights their way. He reveals their path to them. So that's why there's light imagery in the Festival of Shelters. So last week we talked about how water was a key theme, and we talked about how there was actually a water ceremony. Same thing's going to be true today, that light is a key theme, and at the Festival of Shelters, there was a light ceremony. It was called the illumination of the temple, and what they would do was illuminate the temple. Just so you know. So, in the temple, there was this sort of, the main courtyard was called the Court of the Women, and around that courtyard there were 4 giant candelabra, okay, like 4 giant lampstands. These things, so it's a 75-foot tall pillar. On top of the pillar is, in kind of an X pattern, there's 4 bowls, big bowls that they would fill with oil, and then the wicks, there were cloth wicks in that oil, they would lamp it. It was an oil lamp, okay? 4 oil lamps at the top of each of these lampstands, or candelabra as they were called. Every day of the Festival of Shelters, as darkness fell, the priests would go around and they would light those lamps. And as they were lighting them, in and around the lighting, they would read scriptures that talked about God guiding Israel, okay, in the desert specifically, or more generally, God guiding Israel throughout their history and being their light. Okay, so there's a big long list of scriptures that they read. I'll just give you 2. So Psalm 78 says, "For he divided the sea and led them through, making the water stand up like walls. In the daytime he led them by a cloud, and all night by a pillar of fire." So retelling that Exodus story. And then some of them were more general, like this. Psalm 43 verse 3, saying to God, "Send out your light and your truth. Let them guide me. Let them lead me to your holy mountain, to the place where you live." So they light the lamps, and they're reading all these scriptures that are talking about how God guides Israel, how God is a light to Israel. And if you picture it, the temple, within the city walls of Jerusalem, the temple is up on a hill called the Temple Mount. And then these lampstands are 75 feet tall, and so sort of all around the city you would see the lampstands lit. And the teaching of the rabbis, this is going to be important, the teaching of the rabbis was that all of Jerusalem glowed with the light from the temple. Now, watch what happens. Here comes Jesus, and he says this thing we already read, "I'm the light of the world." Where and when does he say it? He says it, we know he says it at the festival. Chapter 8, verse 20 tells us where he says it. Jesus made these statements while he was teaching in the section of the temple known as the treasury. Why would John mention that? He mentions it because the treasury is another name for the court of the women. The treasury is another name for the courtyard that has these lampstands where the illumination of the temple took place. Okay? Are you starting to put it together a little bit? He's saying Jesus talks about being the light of the world in this room where they do the illumination of the temple ceremony. He might have done it, he might have said this right as they were lighting the lamps. We don't know. He might have kind of, or maybe he waited till evening and did it, just before they lit the lamps, just as people were starting to say, someone should turn on the light, it's starting to get dark. And then Jesus jumps in and says, hey, I'm the light of the world. Or maybe he waited till after they were lit and he looked, and you could see the light in the temple, and that's when he said it. But in any case, he's saying this, and throughout John, Jesus has impeccable timing. He's saying this light of the world speech, he's saying it in the room with the big lampstands where they do this big ceremony where they remember that God is their light. That's where he stands up and says, I'm the light of the world. If you follow me, you won't have to walk in darkness because you will have the light that leads to life. Just like when Jesus said, I'm the bread of life. Just like when Jesus said, if anyone's thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Where he says it and when he says it is going to really matter. He's not saying this in isolation. He's evoking all of this history, all of this teaching, and all of this awareness that is loaded into the festival ceremony. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about what Jesus says. So he starts off, and he says, I am the light of the world. I am the light of the world. This is not the first or last time that Jesus is referred to as a light in the Gospel of John. Right in the beginning, John talks about Jesus this way. He says, the Word, that's Jesus, gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everyone. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. Later on in John, Jesus is going to describe his own mission, saying this, I have come as a light to shine in this dark world, so that all who put their trust in me will no longer remain in the dark. And so one of the key motifs that John uses, the key descriptors for Jesus, is that it's a dark world, and Jesus has come to be a light amidst that darkness. More on that later. He says, I'm the light of what? Of the world. In Greek, the word for world is cosmos, from which we get the English word cosmos. For God so loved the world. Cosmos is also really important in the Gospel of John. There's a really important verse, maybe you've heard of it, that starts out, for God so loved the cosmos, the world. So watch what happens then. Think about what's going on around Jesus when he says this. Here's this group of people celebrating their national identity, celebrating their national history, celebrating how God has cared for their nation. Jesus drops into that festival, that context, and he says, I'm the light of the Jews. No. You would expect him maybe to say, I'm the light of the Jews, but he says, I'm the light of the world. He's pushing them, in other words, to a bigger vision. Here they are at this festival where they're saying, they've lit these lamps and they're saying, all of Jerusalem is glowing with the light of the temple. And Jesus comes and says, my mission is to bring a light where the whole world will glow from this light. My mission is not to make sure that Jerusalem is aglow with light, but that the cosmos is aglow with my light. See, one of the dangers of religion, then and now, is that it can become too focused on the insiders. It can become so focused on us, on what God is doing for us, and it's all about us. And that's not Jesus' mission and vision. Jesus drops in and says, no, it's more than that. It's for the cosmos. So, South Langley, the challenge that Jesus brings to the Jews, he brings to us too. May it never be true of us that we're so obsessed with lighting our own building, our own space, our own group, that we leave Langley and Canada and the world in darkness. Someone should probably say amen. May it never be true of us that we say, oh, it's so good to think about how God has favored our people. Now, God sent Jesus to light the cosmos. That's the size of the vision in the Bible. Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. He goes on, if you follow me. If you follow me. Remember that the Festival of Shelters is all about a story of following a light. Right? The people of Israel for 40 years followed this light. Do you see what Jesus is doing here? He's saying, listen, the way that your ancestors followed that light, they clung to it for dear life, knowing that if they lost it, they were toast. When it moved, they moved. When it stopped, they stopped. No matter how convenient it was their lifeline. They clung to it. Follow me like that, says Jesus. So it puts a couple of questions in front of us. If you're not a Christian, if you're not following Jesus, and we're glad that you're here, we have to ask you the question, who are you following? You're following someone. All of us are following someone. Often in this modern age, it's actually really easy to figure out who you're following them, because your phone says you're following them. Like, I'm being serious. Like, probably the people you're following on the phone are the people that you're following. Who are you following? And I need you to ask yourself this question. Whoever you're following, whatever guru, whatever author, whatever movement, are they solid enough to lead you through the wilderness? Okay, really ask yourself that in the toughest moment of your life, are they solid enough to lead you through that moment? The teaching of the Bible is that Jesus is the only one who can lead us through the desert unscathed. Who are you following? If you are a Christian, if you're following Jesus, then the question becomes, if you are a Christian and you are following Jesus, the question becomes not who are you following, but how closely are you following Jesus? How closely are you following him? Think about the Israelites and the pillar of fire. Okay? 40 years, between 1 and 2 million people. Do you think that at times it was inconvenient, it was maybe not the most opportune time for the pillar to start moving? You ever think about that? Like, you know, you've got a turkey in the oven, half cooked, company's coming over, the table is set, and you hear your neighbor yell, "Hey, the pillar's moving!" Really? Nah. We were trying to do this get-together for weeks. We're going to have to reschedule. Like, for real, it would have been a bad time a lot of the time. But what did they do? And If that pillar gets over the horizon and we lose it, we're lost in the desert. And that's the end for us. So they pack up and follow him. Christians, do we follow Jesus like that? Where it's like, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's bad timing, we don't procrastinate and say, oh, go on ahead, Jesus, I'll catch up later. How closely are we following Jesus? And then the rest of the verse says, if you follow me, you won't have to walk in darkness because you will have the light that leads to life. It's worth stating that light leads to life. Jesus is going to say later on at the Festival of Shelters, actually, he's going to say, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Okay, we're going to cover that in a few weeks, but that's what Jesus is trying to lead us into. He's not trying to lead us into this sort of, Ned Flanders, flavorless, just be nice, don't get into trouble, boring existence. No, he's the creator who knows how your life can be most fulfilling, most meaningful, and the creator has come to lead you into that kind of life. Light leads to life, and it's also worth pointing out that darkness leads to death, okay? It's not stated explicitly here, although you can kind of deduce it, right? Light leads to life, so darkness probably leads to death. Certainly that's true in Scripture. Certainly that would have been true for Israel in the desert, walking in the darkness. They're dead. For the climbers on Everest, walking one more step in the darkness and they were dead. Walking in darkness leads to death, and when John talks about darkness, he's talking really about two things. He kind of uses darkness as a symbol, and it's generally referring to two things: blindness and sin. Okay, blindness in the sense that you can't find the right way. You don't know where you should be going. You don't know what you should believe. Okay, that's one kind of walking in darkness. And then the other piece is sin, in the sense that you're in darkness and there are things that you're doing that are wrong. So are you walking in darkness? Sometimes you just let Scripture ask you some questions, right? This verse is asking me, are you walking in darkness? Maybe you're walking darkness in the sense of blindness. Okay, you ever have that feeling in your life where you're searching for that thing that's going to make your life fall into place, make you feel like you have a coherent direction in your life? I read this week that from 2016 to 2017, unit sales of self-help books rose 18%. It's the fastest growing nonfiction genre. See, despite this sort of bravado that we have as a culture where we say, I'm going to make my own way, we're actually looking for someone to help us find the way. See, for a lot of us, we're actually kind of a little bit lost, and we're looking for someone to remove us from the darkness that we're walking in. We're looking for someone to show us the way. Maybe you're walking in darkness when it comes to blindness and direction for your life and what do I believe. Maybe you're walking in darkness when it comes to sin. Sin has a way of growing in the dark. Bad things grow in the dark. So we moved into a new townhouse this year. New to us, it's actually an old townhouse. It's like 35 years old. Older houses tend to have like some dark, nooks and crannies. We have yet to shine a light into one of the dark spaces in our house and find like a beautiful grapevine with plump, juicy grapes. Or like a lovely rose garden. Those things don't grow in the dark. we have found a little bit of mold, and silverfish. Those are something straight out of a nightmare. They love to hang out in the dark. See, bad things grow in the dark. And sin is one of them. And all of us tend to accumulate things growing in the dark corners of our lives. Things that are wrong. And we have this bad habit of just leaving it dark and not dealing with it. There's a painful verse earlier in John where Jesus says, God's light came into the world, but people loved the darkness more than the light, for their actions were evil. All who do evil hate the light and refuse to go near it for fear their sins will be exposed. See, it's much easier in the short term to leave it dark, leave our sin, leave what's wrong in our life just growing in the dark. Don't shine a light on it. Don't let Jesus into that part of your life even. Don't let other people into that part of your life. Just leave it growing there. I have some bad news. If you just leave it growing in the dark, it's still there. Like it's still there. If it's like mold, then it's going to make your life toxic. If it's like silverfish, you're going to turn on the light one day and it's going to scare you. Like it's going to show up out of nowhere and ruin your morning. Jesus says, don't walk in darkness. So, with all of this said, I want to leave us with 3 questions. And I'm trusting that the Holy Spirit is going to lay one of these questions, maybe one, but I'm hoping one of these questions on your heart and that it will start to work on you. So I'm going to put these before you. I'm going to leave you with them. We're actually going to take some time here just to pray through them a little bit. And I want to invite you to take 1 or 2 or all 3 of them this week. Pray through it yourself. Talk through it with your spouse or close Christian friends. Talk about it in your care group. Here are the questions as we sort of wrap up what this text has to say to us. Okay, number 1. Have you focused more on bringing light to your own life or to the cosmos? Are we a people? Are we people who become focused on the insiders and our group, those who are already saved, rather than shining light forth in whatever cosmos is your cosmos, whatever context is your cosmos? Question 2, whom are you following? If it's not Jesus, are they solid enough to lead you through the wilderness? If it is Jesus, how closely are you following him? And question 3, are you walking in light, or are there areas in your life where you are walking in darkness, either in some kind of blindness or some kind of sin that you're letting sit? And so I want to invite the worship team up. Prayer team can take their places as well. Do encourage you to make use of the prayer team today if there's anything that you're working through. What we're going to do in a moment is we're going to go into prayer together. I'm just going to sort of introduce the prayer. I'm going to start off the prayer, and I'm going to leave a time of silence. And we're going to ask God just to work on our hearts with one of these questions coming out of this text. We're going to ask God, what is the question, like which one of these is for me, and how do I respond? And then I'll close this out, our time to prayer up, and then we'll respond in song. Would you stand with me as we go to prayer? Let's pray. Jesus, we affirm that you are the light of the world. We thank you that you have not left us in darkness, but that you came to lead us into light and into life. And as we consider these questions of lighting giving light to the world, the cosmos around us, as we consider who we're following and how we're following you, and as we consider whether we're potentially still walking in darkness, I ask that you would set one of those in each of our hearts and begin to show us where you're convicting us and where you'd like us to respond. Let's just spend some time silently now. And so, Jesus, we love you, and we ask that we would not be content with darkness. We ask you to shine into every corner of our lives, remove what needs to be removed, expose what needs to be exposed. Give us the courage not to hide. And Jesus, allow us to follow you, because we know that you'll lead us into life. In your name we pray. Amen. So remain standing as we sing.